On the morning of September 23rd, 1851, 3 men cut through the Adirondack forest and stepped into something that refused the name of ordinary tragedy. The smoke they trailed hung thin against the pines like a question left unanswered. The cabin they found was not merely hidden, it was designed to be survived by obsession. Inside, a boy sat in a ring of bone and carved tokens, thin as old rope, his eyes fierce with an intelligence that did not match the shape of his body. When he spoke, a sound came that the men at the doorway could not place among their maps of speech. Rhythms clicked and folded into guttural syllables, a cadence older than the market and older than the church bell. Dr. Schuyler, who had studied human tongues and plant medicines alike, felt something in his chest change when the boy uttered certain sounds, as if a door in his head had been nudged. They found journals beneath floorboards, written in precise, deliberate hand, the first entries calm and domesticated, the later pages tilting into diagrams and lists of bodily experiments. Ezra Harwick's script grew angrier across the pages, then colder, then almost scientific. The family's origin had not been a simple frontier romance, but a deliberate retreat from a world they judged rotten. Ezra had come to hate what he called civilization's gloss. He taught his children to see words as traps that bent perception. He argued that ordinary language had become a shroud, and so he worked to tear it away, carving out words he called truer, then teaching them to his children until little Benjamin answered only to those new names. When Reverend Hinton offered shelter, he found Benjamin frightened of doors and drawn to patterns on the Reverend's floor. The boy flinched at polite conversation and flourished when shown animal bones arranged in counters and knots. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If this voice begins to unmake the world you know, subscribe and tell us where you are listening from. Tell me the state or country and watch how very many of your local archives hide their own small contagions. Listen closely. What I will relate is not idle history, but an invitation to notice what your elders have buried. Do not shrug this away, the sound finds true listeners. Ezra Harwick had once been a schoolmaster who believed instruction could order the world. He taught reading and sums and, for a time, respected neighborly propriety. Hard times tore that life away, bank failures ruined livelihoods, and a society that seemed to prize speed and coin over steadiness and truth. Ezra fled east to the timber and the horizon, convinced that safety lived in subtraction. He told Sarah that ordinary words were nets that trapped thought, and he began patiently and then obsessively to cut them away. The family's valley lay behind ridges that promised concealment. It offered water, game, and a geography that refused easy paths. At first the Harwicks found miracle in provisioning themselves. Sarah's knowledge of herbs kept them from ache and famine, and Ezra's lean resourcefulness converted saplings into shelter. But his pedagogy shifted into experiment. Morning lessons became ritualized eliminations of common terms. Children learned technical names for plants and stars, but were forbidden everyday labels that bound people to market and church. Ezra devised a new set of sounds, careful clicks, stern vowels, guttural cadences he claimed were less corrupted by social artifice. Benjamin learned quickly. He became fluent in a small, dangerous lexicon while the neighbors who passed by saw only a family that kept to itself. The journals left beneath the floorboards showed the progression schedules of drills, lists of forbidden words, diagrams of posture, and instructions for surgical procedures scrawled beside lessons on grammar. Ezra ordered instruments and recorded measurements as if the family were a laboratory rather than a household. His writing shifts in tone from pedagogical pride to an almost clinical dispassion, annotating the boys' responses as if testing an apparatus. When traders in Newcomb later recalled Ezra's last visit before the family's silence, they remembered a man with hollowed cheeks who spoke in phrases that unsettled rather than comforted, who purchased knives and salts in patterns that suggested design more than domestic need. In those pages he records experiments that blur instruction and incision, measurements of endurance, lists of animals butchered for ritual study, and an insistence that the boy answer only to the new language. When Dr. Schuyler first tried to map the boy's vocal patterns, he held a clinician's steadiness against a rising inside dread. He spoke gently, offering bread, pointing at simple objects and pronouncing their common names, watching for sign or recognition. Benjamin returned the looks with a kind of precise blankness, and then responded in the strange cadence his father had taught, uttering clusters of sound that carried internal order where English would have been fragmented. The doctor noted regular alternations of clicks and open vowels, a grammar that marked emphasis through breath rather than pitch. He recorded these patterns in long, laborious letters sent to colleagues in Albany and to a friend in New York City, appealing for linguistic insight and for the theoretical frameworks that might explain a child who apparently thought in a system foreign to the familiar human mosaic. At Reverend Hinton's house, the challenge became social as well as medical. The Reverend and his wife Elizabeth, who had taken the boy into their larger, more civilized home, tried the ordinary rituals of kindness: bed, modest food, a clean shirt, the steady click of a clock. Benjamin accepted the comforts but treated them like instruments in a lesson. He lay awake conversing with shadow patterns, arranging pebbles by size like a person rehearsing a syntax. He seemed unable to accept privacy, sharing aloud thoughts in that private speech, as if words were currency to be spent publicly. The community reacted as small towns do. Curiosity turned quickly to suspicion. Children began to mimic the sounds, at first with cruel imitation and then with genuine fascination, which only increased the Reverend's anxiety. Scholars who later read Schuyler's letters observed something else in the notes, a set of moral anxieties folded into scientific description. Doctors of the period feared contagion of ideas almost as they feared disease, and the notion that a manner of speaking could reorient moral judgment made men of reason uncomfortable. Yet the letters also contain instances of wonder. Schuyler wrote of moments when Benjamin's utterances seemed to expand perception, naming plant properties before a botany book could. The contrast between terror and amazement threaded through every account, producing a dissonant chorus that made those who read it feel they were looking at more than a child. They were glimpsing a hinge in human possibility. They debated whether to protect or hide, and decisions followed consequences swiftly, inevitably. The cabin's walls were a manuscript of a mind unraveling into pattern. Symbols crowded every surface. Charcoal and a dark binding had been used to accentuate lines until the room seemed to breathe with intent. Bones hung from rafters like tolly marks, and the men who inspected the place reported a coldness, as if the building itself had been taught to recall certain movements. The journals told of seasons counted not by harvest but by experiments, and the notation of surgical attempts sat beside drawings of hunting scenes. One entry described in exact detail the reshaping of a child's teeth into points, rationalized as an adaptation for certain diets and for the carrying of ritual authority. When the local constable Culver prepared his official report, he hesitated over language and chose words that would not inflame superstition. But the newspapers of the county printed what they could, and rumor did the rest. Those who read the journals later said there was a quality of pedagogy that turned brutal when combined with isolation. Ezra's philosophy had metastasized into praxis, a classroom that performed operations, a grammar that demanded ritual compliance. The boy, Benjamin, when asked to leave the cabin, protested in a manner that convinced Dr. Schuyler there were prohibitions written into his mind. He pointed repeatedly to the carved wall and used phrases that translated, roughly, to commands and to boundary markers, as if the space itself had rules that must not be violated. The Reverend and his circle argued about care, custody, and whether to involve the state, fearing both scandal and contagion of belief. Men who sought to categorize the scene often did so with tremulous certainty, and others argued that the state should lock the papers away for polite society's sake. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Decisions were made in the shadow of reputations. Some records were indeed sealed under quiet orders, sealed not by law alone, but by the willing silence of clerks and physicians who worried what would happen if this language multiplied. When county officials stamped files as restricted, they did not merely remove pages from public gaze, they attempted to excise curiosity itself, to let a wound crust over in secrecy. But secrets have a gravity even buried. Strange sounds tug at memory and at the edge of civilized restraint. Listen, remember, always. Schuyler's correspondence is where science and dread entwine into a single braid. He catalogued phonemes and gestures like a man trying to inventory an approaching storm. In Albany, he used clinical terms. In New York, he allowed himself a more speculative voice, writing of perception, of the possibility that certain patterns of speech altered the way one registered cause and effect. He sent drawings of the carved symbols, transcriptions of the child's utterances, and accounts of the boy's behavior that read at times like field notes and at other times like prayer. Physicians who read the pages argued about method. Was Benjamin the product of an artificial schooling that produced an internal syntax, or had isolation and ritualized deprivation intervened to create a different cognitive architecture altogether? Some scholars considered contaminated memetics and worried about the diffusion of dangerous ideas. Others, more empirically minded, focused on the tangible oddities. The boy's teeth filed to points, his startling ease with butchering techniques, his ability to navigate the forest as though its lee lines braided themselves into his memory. Schuyler recorded episodes in which Benjamin named the location of a hidden spring by a sound that required no pointing and, in another case, identified a poisonous berry by voice alone before any adult recognized it. These feats suggested not merely education but an internal repertoire keyed to a different taxonomy of reality. While scholars argued, the townspeople gossiped. Some mothers forbade their children from playing near the Reverend's yard. Others, privy to Schuyler's sympathetic notes, brought their sick to his small clinic, hoping perhaps that the boy's strange language might carry remedies undiscovered in the books. Amid this social churn, the institutional response hardened. A prosecutor in the county considered legal action for the mistreatment of a child. A magistrate worried about contagion of belief. The state physician worried about a hazard no law could neatly define. When the unsealed portions circulated among a few discreet scholars, whispers named the possibility of training minds to obey a geometry of ritual rather than human law. Attempts to reverse the process proved more revealing than salvage. Clergy and doctors tried to teach Benjamin the simplest phrases of everyday life and watched them slide off him as if oil on glass. He did not so much refuse them as treat them like objects foreign to his understanding, experimenting with them, tapping them like contraptions to see if they would produce the expected effect. When Mrs. Hinton whispered, "This is your home," he would answer in a low pattern that suggested his mind had mapped the word home onto a lattice of obligations and prohibitions. A neighbor woman, who had lost grandchildren to fever years before, reported that Benjamin once hummed a phrasing that calmed a sick child. No prayer, no tonic, just the rhythm of his speech. These paradoxes haunted men used to tidy causality. The journals contained more than surgical notes. They catalogued borrowings from old folk practices, the appropriation of marks and counting systems whose provenance none of the Harwicks could properly name. Some symbols resembled hunting tally marks, others evaded identification entirely. When Dr. Schuyler compared the carvings to known scripts, he found accidental resemblances, but no direct lineage, enough to make him suspect synthesis rather than inheritance. As the county debated whether Benjamin should be institutionalized, he was instead enrolled in a series of observational trials. Observers recorded the boy recreating complex bone patterns from memory, arranging vertebrae into spirals and grids without hesitation. His fingers moved as if rehearsing grammar. To the eyes of some, the arrangements had a utility, preserving parts for measured study. To others, the displays read like an insistence on order for its own sake, an insistence that the world be reduced to a pattern to be obeyed. Within the small circle of caretakers, arguments turned bitter. Some feared political scandal and wanted the boy removed. Others believed he might be a conduit to knowledge otherwise lost. In the margins of Schuyler's letters, one finds a human admission that sometimes, late at night, when the wind rubbed the Reverend's shutters, the boy's speech seemed to align with the carved marks, and the whole house would vibrate with a coherent sense of purpose, as if the room itself were rehearsing a different law. Remember, language shapes what remains. The state's reaction demonstrated how institutions prefer a closed narrative to an ongoing puzzle. Minutes from meetings show officials balancing public order and reputational risk. They worried that sensational claims would erode trust in local courts, and they feared imitators. Clerks redacted phrases, magistrates recommended restrictions. An archivist's note later reads like a nervous confession restricted by order of state. See File 17. That effort to classify and contain created a vacuum in which rumor thrived, and in that vacuum older patterns found purchase. Men with vested reputations called for restraint. Others, gifted with suspicion, proposed more sinister readings. That the Harwick experiment revealed a method by which authority could be reconfigured. If a speech could reorder attention and moral salience, who would control such utterances? The possibility hooked into the anxieties of bureaucrats and ministers who had seen language used daily to bind sinners, to bless wealth, to reassure the faithful. Dr. Schuyler, who had been both clinician and witness, wrote private notes that betray his divided mind. He signed some correspondence with the clinical shorthand of a physician, but in the margins he appended phrases that read like a man keeping a journal of temptation. He confessed a fascination so deep it threatened to eclipse his duty. At times he admired the boy's facility, at times the admiration curdled into fear that whatever had formed Benjamin might replicate in a mind that learned his patterns. The Reverend faced a different kind of trial. To his flock he preached compassion, yet he also felt the pressure of parish opinion that demanded protection from scandal. Behind closed doors, he and Elizabeth argued into the night about whether to seek a court order or to hide what they had found in hopes that time would dull its edge. Their indecision produced delay, and delay produced accusation. Newspapers printed thin, sensationalized accounts, and letters of inquiry arrived from clergymen in adjacent counties. In that noisy space, the possibility persisted that language, deliberately redesigned, could be used as a mechanism of control rather than as an instrument of liberty. So a pattern emerged among officials: seal, minimize, and redirect attention elsewhere, hoping the discomfort would be absorbed by time and routine, until curiosity dwindled and records lay dormant. But a few did not forget privately. Benjamin's warnings were not mere childish superstition. In moments of clarity, he attempted to convey a set of rules, a moral geometry hardwired into sounds and marks. When he pointed back toward the valley during his first removal, his voice unfurled with intensity, each syllable knifing like a direction. He described prohibitions that he could not transpose into English, gestures that accompanied certain utterances like punctuation for the flesh. The caretakers struggled to translate, and what they gleaned was unsettling. The language distinguished between permitted acts and forbidden taboos, and some prohibitions seemed to function like internal locks, mechanisms that made certain acts unthinkable to Benjamin and, perhaps, taught him not to feel certain common human appetites as urgent. Schuyler wrote that he watched the boy recoil at some quotidian impulse and trace it back to a clipped phrase in the lexicon Ezra had taught him. The implications unnerved him. Could speech be engineered to mute desire, to narrow moral range, or to broaden the horizon for what one judged acceptable? Those who read the records later felt the chill of a broader logic. A system of language could reorient conscience and affiliation, shifting loyalty away from individual neighbors and toward rules and patterns. That shift, analysts realized, is the architecture of control. Men in places of power grasped the implications like a new instrument, one that might be used to bind crews, to create obedience, to remodel communal life without visible chains. Yet another possibility frightened them more, that a language such as this could liberate, opening access to perceptions the modern mind had lost. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. The caretakers faced an impossible choice between removing the boy to a hospital, where he might be studied and his speech dissected, or returning him to the valley that acted as both school and prison. The decision revealed profound priorities. Did one honor individual care and dignity, or did one prioritize the containment of an idea that might, once taught, spread like a small, saprophytic algae across the mind's surface? Their hesitation fed the rumor mill, and in that churn the possibility multiplied, until the case was no longer simply about one family, but about what any society would risk to hold its definitions intact. We will follow those ripples further, understand how a language became a tool and a weapon. Curiosity, like water, finds cracks to leak through. Even when public documents were stamped restricted, private networks took interest. Letters from Schuyler moved by hand between Albany scholars, An engraver copied samples of the carvings and shared them with a small circle who met in low-light rooms to debate whether a language could be reverse-engineered. They joked at first, then fell silent, then became fervent. One young philologist confided that the patterns raised questions about the limits of lexical definition. A junior physician wondered whether ritualized diction could be translated into therapeutic practice. The conversations shifted from academia into the practical. How many disciples would it take for a mode of speech to propagate within a community? Could one teach it without invoking the lived experiments that produced it? This is where power and ethics collided. A handful of men, some with credentials and some with darker appetites, concluded it was possible to teach selected elements, to abstract the functional parts of the dialect and leave behind the crueler practices. They formed private gatherings where the boys' transcriptions were studied like musical scores. In those rooms, the language lost some of its rawness and gained a procedural clarity. Men recorded exercises, lists of syllables linked to acts of attention, and drills meant to reframe how a listener perceived cause. A municipal official, tempted by the prospect of social stability, envisioned using such techniques to quiet restless crowds. A minister imagined persuading parishioners away from vice. The ethical fog thickened. When some practitioners attempted to apply fragments to real experiments, results varied. In one account, an apprentice reported calm in a brigand after exposure to a repetitive cadence. In another, a youth fell into a state of shame that would not leave him for months. The difference lay in intent and context. Without understanding the whole system, a lattice of prohibitions, symbols, and rituals, application was dangerous. Even those who believed they would wield the method benevolently discovered that the mechanism responded to an internal logic, not to the moral preferences of its teachers. Thus the experiment escaped containment in a new form, shifting from the remote valley to the drawing rooms and secret labs of those who sought to harness speech as an instrument of governance. Eventually whispers reached hesitant editors. Some demanded closure, while ambitious men secretly sought manuals, names, and addresses to reproduce the method in their own circles elsewhere. Adoption rarely followed the script those early philologists hoped for. When fragments of the language were taught without the context that shaped them, practices turned brittle and ideological. A temperance society in a neighboring county, eager to quell rumors of vice and to present a sober front for donors, invited a charismatic practitioner to trial a set of cadences meant to temper craving. The effect in small meetings was unpredictable. Some men left feeling chastened. Others reported fits of shame so acute they took to their beds. In one account, a foreman at a mill used a shortened rhythm as a means of disciplining apprentices, and attendance fell but productivity rose in ways that made employers quietly pleased. News of such results rippled through chambers and clubs. Those in power saw an elegant instrument that required no visible whip. But instruments shaped people. They did not merely shape actions. Young men subjected to repeated drills found their moral imaginations narrowing. They lost a certain tender appetite for neighbors' plights. Wearing the method like a new tool, communities sometimes traded compassion for order. Worse, when the language was adapted to religious ends, it acquired a sanctity that insulated it from critique. Men who combined doctrinal fervor with procedural cadence produced congregations willing to believe in the rightness of authoritarian demands. The danger was not inevitable, but it was real. A practice that could refine attention could also blunt conscience. In whispered rooms, small committees discussed ethical guardrails, yet committees are paper maps when faced with a technology that rewires how people sense value. As adoption widened, a countercurrent emerged. People who recognized the language's capacity for reorientation began to teach defensive habits, ways to counter the cadence, and to reassert lexical friction. They taught citizens to notice patterns, to hold words lightly, to preserve a margin of doubt. But defensive instruction proved unevenly distributed, accessible only where a network of sympathetic teachers existed, and thus the method's influence remained tied to social power. What mattered most was who controlled the teaching, for the same sounds that calmed one ear could harden the heart of another. Those debates would outlast individual lives and shape institutions in ways that quietly restructure consent permanently. Decades layered over the initial events like sediment. The valley fell back into green and memory frayed around its edges, but the practice fragmented, repurposed, stripped of context, found new homes. Apprentices of the original circle became teachers, and their pupils became invisible vectors in towns and clubs. Sometimes the uptake occurred in benevolent guise. A philanthropic school hired a man who had learned a toned down set of cadences to help children with violent impulses, reporting reductions in aggression and better classroom order. Other times the method was a shadow in a courtroom or a whip disguised as language in a factory office. As the 19th century gave way to the modernizing pressures of the next, institutions adapted the practice into techniques for training attention rather than for surgical transformation. Manualized variants appeared, shorthand drills that bore the architecture if not the full depth of Ezra's original experiments. Historians, decades later, would find fragments in unexpected places, marginalia in a minister's sermon notes, an odd cadence preserved in the instruction manual of a midwife, a pattern repeated in a mason's counting song. These slivers suggested that the language had been hammered into the grain of daily life, sometimes for the better, sometimes to the detriment of moral imagination. At the same time, institutional memory remained partial. Files continued to be stamped restricted or simply misplaced. Scholars ruthlessly curious found hints but no full key, and some suggested the missing pages had been removed by hand because they contained more than embarrassment. They named processes too efficient at creating obedience. This notion produced its own political economy. If knowledge of production could make people more governable, then concealment served those who wished to keep the public sphere pliant. Those who resisted this quiet control formed networks to teach lexical resistance, practices that emphasized the messiness of human life, that reintroduced ambiguity and unpredictability as moral resources. In small corners of communities, these resistive lessons took root, providing a counterweight to drilled compliance. The push and pull shaped legislation, pedagogy, and social custom. It shaped how magistrates wrote rulings, how teachers designed drills, and how ministers chose metaphors that either encouraged dissent or quelled it. Accommodations rippled into elections and the architecture of civic consent in small communities. Benjamin grew with an intelligence that both fascinated and isolated him. The Reverend's house could not contain the specific architecture of his mind, so he moved between caretakers and clinicians like an object under study. Adolescence altered his body, but his speech retained the ordered cadences of Ezra's lexicon. Adolescents in town mocked what they did not understand, which made him sullen and secretive. When he was older, some attempted to translate his abilities into vocation. A sympathetic herbalist taught him botany in return for catalogue work. A millwright tried to recruit him for the precision of his hands. All these efforts failed to fully domesticate him. At times, Benjamin displayed a fierce tenderness. He would repair a neighbor's tool without charge, or he would sing a low cadence that calmed an anxious horse. And at others he exhibited a coldness that made listeners recoil, the product of a mind trained to see the world in terms of rules and prohibitions. As he matured, he became adept at crossing social boundaries. At a lecture, he might answer a question with an archaic phrase that left the audience uncertain whether they had been enlightened or shamed. Physicians took interest and attempted therapies that combined talk, exposure, and controlled ritual. Their notebooks reveal a fascination and a fear. Some clinicians believed they could redirect his perception toward ordinary lexical maps. Others worried any such attempt would strip him of the tools that had preserved his survival. A public episode crystallized these tensions. At a town meeting, a man accused a foreman of abuse, and the gathering turned febrile with anger. Benjamin, who had been present, rose and spoke in a clipped cadence that seemed to fragment the crowd's outrage. He named the foreman's transgression in terms that linked action to a ritualized punishment historically foreign to the town's legal sensibilities. People left the meeting quieter and more disoriented than before, and in the aftermath some praised Benjamin as a savior, while others called for him to be banned from public gatherings. The incident made it clear that his speech was not merely performative. It could reframe collective affect and redirect communal energies in ways that unsettled the existing moral grammar. The town's leaders debated sequestration, guardianship, and study. but the ultimate decision always returned to a question of who had authority to redefine what citizens felt and who would guard that power and why. As news and rumor traversed county lines, the entanglement of language and power drew attention from broader institutions. Men with connections to military supply and to philanthropic boards imagined applications and wrote proposals in sober, knowing tones. A professor at a state college drafted a memorandum suggesting controlled courses to teach attention training as part of moral education. A hospital director proposed pilot programs to calm violent patients without restraints. These proposals framed the method as therapeutic and civic, language of benevolence masking the architecture of authority. Manuals were written that translated cadences into drills, removed the Cruella rites, and repackaged the practice for polite use. Yet the repackaging could not erase the core's capacity to reorganize desire. Prisons tested truncated versions to reduce recidivism. Factories used syllabic sequences to increase focus on repetitive tasks. Reformatories touted their ability to make boys orderly citizens through a regimen of speech exercises. In each adoption, the social rent was paid in subtle yields, inhibition of spontaneity, a narrower moral imagination, and sometimes a loss of empathy easiest to miss because productivity improved. Opponents began to critique the practices not in moralizing terms but in institutional language. They spoke of degraded civic capacity, of homogenized workforce subjectivity, and of a public sphere less capable of dissent. Yet believers measured successes and pressed onward, arguing that the ends, public safety, order, fewer deaths, justified the means. The language thus morphed into an administrative tool embedded in paperwork, training schedules, and reform programs. In that quiet embedding, its radical origins faded. Yet whispering copies of the original journals persisted in private hands, and from time to time a scholar or an activist would stumble upon a passage that hinted at the original ethical cost. These finds would occasionally ignite debate, producing investigative pamphlets and heated sermons, but institutional momentum often overran critique. A generation later, the descendants of those early churches and committees did not recall the harshness that birthed the method. They remembered only that certain drills reduced brawl and increased productivity. Families passed down songs and cadences without context. Yet in attic trunks and bound ledgers, the faint smell of Ezra's original ink remained, and occasionally the question returned, and unsettled consciences. Exposure came in fits and starts. Investigative writers compiled scattered citations and published pamphlets that read like detective work, threading together the Harwick journals, Schuyler's private copies, and accounts of ritual adopters. Their language was vivid and accusatory, accusing municipalities and institutions of complicity in creating a social technology that reduced citizens' capacity for moral imagination. Trials followed in some localities, where witnesses recounted the use of rhythmic speech in reform programs and testified to its depressive effects on empathy. Those proceedings forced public debate. Should the state ban such practices outright, regulate them, or insist on informed consent? Legislatures drafted laws with clumsy hands and good intentions, and courts struggled to find legal categories for harms that were diffuse, slow, and sometimes indistinguishable from ordinary discipline. In many instances, statutes were watered down to avoid crippling institutions, such as hospitals and prisons, that argued they needed tools to maintain order. The resulting legal landscape was messy, a web of permissions, prohibitions, and bureaucratic exceptions that left practice largely intact, but under a nominal watch. Meanwhile, defenders of the method refined their rhetoric, arguing that what critics called coercion was actually compassionate structuring, a way to save lives by limiting dangerous impulses. Those defenders found receptive audiences among philanthropists and some municipal leaders who valued measurable outcomes over the arguably messy business of moral cultivation. Even when thoughtful regulation arrived, its implementation depended on power, who sat on oversight boards, which experts were near the pulpit, and which funders determined the scale of interventions. Thus the debate persisted and became institutionalized itself, a constant negotiation between control and care, between the efficient ordering of bodies and the intangible necessity of human unpredictability. Occasionally a whistleblower emerged from within the walls of an institution, a nurse, a teacher, a clerk, who risked livelihood to reveal manuals and audio transcriptions. Some of these brave disclosures were crushed by legal suits or by public indifference. Others sparked serious reforms in specific districts. Yet secret practitioners adapted. They formed discreet fraternities that taught a more complete curriculum under the guise of cultural studies or therapeutic training. These societies collected the truest fragments and guarded them jealously, replicating the dynamics of the valley, but within genteel settings. Their influence threaded through educational reform movements and even into the counseling professions, always wearing a velvet glove over the mechanism they preserved. The mechanism endured, shifting but keeping its shape. By the early 20th century, the outlines of the method had been stitched into multiple fabrics of social life. Where once it had been carved into cabin walls and taught over bone counters, now it was pressed into pamphlets, woven into educational exercises, and translated into management manuals that used rhythm and repetition to focus laborers in long shifts. Social scientists debated whether such techniques belonged in the realm of pedagogy or propaganda. Advertisers, who had learned the power of repetition on desire, watched with keen interest. The language's affordances, its ability to shape attention, to reduce certain impulses, to elevate ritualized response, made it useful to anyone who needed predictable behavior on scale. Universities studied the practice, sometimes with humanitarian aims, other times under contracts from industries that sought more docile employees. War planners considered whether rhythmic speech could steady troops under fire. Charitable reformers asked whether it could rehabilitate boys with violent tendencies. That duality, care and control, overlap and ethical ambiguity, returned again and again. Critics protested that the technique flattened moral nuance. Proponents replied that countless lives were spared because dangerous impulses were mitigated. The debate reshaped professional standards. Psychology journals published case reports. Ethicists wrote essays on consent, and legal scholars drafted regulations intended to protect the vulnerable. Yet regulation often lagged behind practice. Manuals mutating through editions lost context and acquired euphemisms that made coercion less visible. The older sacristy moved into bureaucracy, where it was socially acceptable. Training modules, institutional policies, and accreditation guidelines. To those inside, the method appeared mundane, a tool among many. To those outside, its origins remained an uncanny whisper. The more normalized the practices became, the less people saw them as feats of radical engineering, and the more they accepted them as just the way civilized life was run. When scandals surfaced, they were contained with settlements and vocational training reforms, not wholesale bans. The practice adapted, became bureaucratic, and, most insidiously, worked its way into the unremarkable language of management and pedagogy, where it reshaped expectations without fanfare. Its legacy is quiet, widespread, and contested today. There is a bitter arithmetic to instruments that reach inside the mind. Their goodness or harm depends entirely on the hands that wield them. Ezra Harwick may have imagined purification when he excised words and taught a new lexicon, but the consequence was neither pure nor singular. His work reshaped a child's moral horizon and produced behaviors that future institutions would find useful for stabilizing restless populations. That usefulness is the danger. Once a practice reduces friction, once it narrows moral imagination and makes people easier to govern, its adoption accelerates because it solves problems quickly. Efficiency becomes the cover for ethical erosion. The Harwick records push us to confront an uncomfortable political fact. Societies will often choose order over the slow, costly work of moral cultivation. Institutions prefer instruments that create compliance to practices that cultivate judgment. The remedy begins with recognition and proceeds with practical measures. First, archives should remain open. Sealing records invites myth and monopoly. Second, education should include critical lexical training, teaching children not merely vocabulary but how words shape attention and value. Third, any intervention that touches attention or alters effect must rest on informed consent, transparent oversight, and distributed authority. Fourth, communities should train people in resisting engineered cadences through practices that reintroduce ambiguity and unpredictability into social life. These defensive habits are neither mystical nor impossible. They are conversations, arts, and pedagogies that cultivate doubt and preserve moral imagination. Activists and scholars who expose hidden uses of such techniques perform essential civic labor. Their work should be supported. None of this guarantees perfect protection. History warns us that safeguards can fray, but such measures make abuse harder and democracy stronger. If the Harwick story teaches anything, it is this: technologies of attention demand democratic control, and vigilance is a civic practice as ordinary and necessary as voting or jury duty. Without that attention, the quiet re-engineering of feeling becomes an infrastructure that changes who we are, one syllable at a time. Locally, citizens can form councils to review institutional programs, insist on open hearings before experimental curricula are adopted, and demand whistleblower protections. Teachers should be trained to notice manipulative drills. Universities must institute ethical review boards with laypersons when funding involves attention-altering techniques. Above all, sustain messy public conversation. When debate is vigorous and visible, no single engineered practice easily calcifies into durable power. Support scholars, fund ethics research, and protect archival access fiercely. Listen, knowledge makes identity porous. Stories like Harwick's do more than inform. They bend the way you notice small things: a scraped tree, a carved symbol in a cellar, a rhythm that calms a child. As you hear this, your attention is being trained in subtle ways. That is the very point of what I narrate. I am both teacher and witness here, asking you to hold contradiction, that understanding the mechanism helps you resist its misuse, but also that knowledge can be co-opted. In subsequent years, Benjamin's presence in the town became a yardstick. People measured their own tolerance by whether they would welcome him to a meeting or force him into exile. Neighbors who once invited him to fix a fence later refused him an evening meal. That small cruelty mattered. It showed how social life recalibrates around suspicion. The most dangerous forms of institutional manipulation operate on that axis, on the slow reconfiguration of who is welcomed into ordinary practice. Meanwhile, certain practices persist in the margins as survival strategies. A grandmother's counting song might carry the echo of a bone pattern. A mason's cadence might hide a shortened drill designed to steady hands at heights. These are not conspiracies but inheritances, the cultural sediment of practices once forged in isolation, now scattered like seeds. To engage with the story is to become aware of the lineage between private experiment and public habit. The Harwick files remind us that policy and practice are braided together. Choices made by clerks and committee members become life, shaping rhythms for those who live under them. You, as a listener, are implicated. Do not approach the tale as a distant moral spectacle. Your region, your country, your institutions likely contain rituals and drills that shape attention in invisible ways. The invitation implicit in this narrative is to interrogate them. Ask how your schools, hospitals, and workplaces train attention, whose interests are served, and who benefits when the limits of empathy are trimmed for efficiency. This is not abstract. It is the difference between thriving, unpredictable life and ordered, constrained survival. Start small, visit archives, ask whether educational curricula include critical language study, speak to union representatives about workplace training methods, support whistleblower protections, and encourage public oversight of experimental programs. Communities that sustain open, critical conversation reduce the risk of engineered practices calcifying into unseen power. Be a witness, be noisy, be persistent. Systems of psychological control rarely wear uniforms. They hide in training manuals, HR schedules, and the soothing rhythms of mandatory briefings. Consider how a workplace ritual, an opening cadence, a branded song, a daily sequence of phrases, can do the quiet work of aligning attention. Repeat something long enough, and its moral edges blur. Workers come to accept norms without deliberation. The same dynamic plays out in broader civic life. Official language, buffered by repetition in speeches and media, can make certain priorities feel natural. These processes are not always sinister in intent. Sometimes they are attempts to scaffold public life amid complexity. But intent matters less than outcome. When repeated forms of speech consistently privilege order over nuance, when drills reduce the capacity for empathic engagement, the social consequence is cumulative. Institutions that install such techniques often do so incrementally, because incremental change avoids alarm and gives participants little reason to object. That is why vigilance requires both breadth and depth to watch disparate institutions where techniques might be embedded, and depth to understand the specific mechanisms at work. Training programs must be transparent, their aims, methods, and evaluations should be publicly accessible. Civic education should teach citizens how attention is shaped and how to retain deliberate skepticism in the face of rhetorical comforts. Moreover, professional ethics needs teeth. Independent review boards with public representation and enforcement capacity can help ensure experiments on attention are not deployed without consent. These practical measures do not guarantee moral perfection, but they make the reengineering of feeling harder to accomplish without scrutiny. Above all, remember that human dignity grows in messy spaces of friction and disagreement. When a society prizes order above that friction, it may succeed at creating efficiency, yet at the expense of something less measurable and more essential, a public life alive with the capacity to surprise and to respond with care rather than default compliance. That is the final, chilling lesson of the Harwick story. Tools that alter attention can be repurposed by good or bad actors, and the difference often hinges on oversight, distribution of authority, and public literacy. We must cultivate institutions that invite critique, not hide innovations behind reputations. Support open archives, fund public ethics, encourage popular education in rhetoric and cognition. Refuse simple assurances from officials who promise safety without transparency. Demand audits, public reporting, and community control over programs that touch minds and speak loudly, and yet the story refuses closure. In a small township archive decades later, a submitter donated a trunk of papers, ecclesiastical receipts, a leather-bound ledger, and a folded packet of severed notes. The notes contained not only Ezra's old cursive, but additions in a different hand, notations that suggested an apprentice had continued the work. Scholars who examined the trunk found marginalia that read like teaching notes, rhythms penciled beside diagrams, fragments of cadences meant for practice. The discovery sparked a new wave of inquiry and argument about continuity and adaptation, producing both academic articles and hushed conversations in the corridors of power. For some, the find was proof that secrecy could not last. For others, it proved that techniques inevitably migrate into normal life. The trunk's papers contained no magic, no panacea, only more human choices. The apprentice's notes revealed someone trying to soften the edges, preserving what seemed useful while discarding cruelty. That ambiguity is telling. The line between preservation and corruption is navigated by judgment, trust, and oversight. Even with evidence in the open, the violence of history does not unspool neatly. The responsibilities of repair remain political and moral. The trunk's arrival at the archive renewed old debates about what to publish and what to redact, who should have access, and how to prevent abuse of knowledge. Some argued to place the papers in a publicly accessible exhibition to foster education. Others urged restricted study under controlled conditions that might prevent misuse. The arguments echo the original dilemma: knowledge both heals and harms, and the way a community manages that tension determines whether it grows resilient or becomes pliant. When archives reopen, they force a community into conversation about memory, trust, and regulation. Citizens must decide whether to transform revealed knowledge into public pedagogy or to sequester it behind professional gates. The safer path is not secrecy but a democratic process, public hearings, community curation, enforceable protections against coercion. These are slow, difficult labors, the kind that require patience and courage. Yet they are the only reliable defense against the quiet creep of techniques that reorder attention. To ignore this labor is to permit a kind of moral erosion that accumulates until it becomes irreversible. Now, we end where we began, with a child in a cabin and the slow, stubborn gravity of human choice. The Harwick affair is not a single monster to be slain. It is a mirror that shows how easily practices born of fear and idealism can calcify into instruments of control. It reminds us that every technique that touches attention demands scrutiny, not only because of possible abuse, but because attention is the substrate of moral life. When you permit others to design how you notice, you give away a portion of how you act. When institutions set the rhythms of daily life without democratic consent, the composition of feeling shifts quietly and imperceptibly. This matters because a polity's moral imagination is its first line of defense against brutality disguised as efficiency. The last thing to vanish under pressure for order is the willingness to entertain messy, open-ended human claims, disagreements, spontaneous help, private griefs that do not fit into neat protocols. If you value a public life that retains surprise and compassion, you must commit to small, sustained acts, defend archives, teach critical lexical habits to children, insist on transparent review of programs that alter moods or attention, and protect those who expose hidden practices. These are the slow muscles of civic health. Do not be seduced by the allure of swift fixes. Quick relief often masks long-term erosion. Hold institutions to account, support whistleblowers, fund independent research, and make conversation messy and loud so that no one cadence can dominate the public air. In the end, the Harwick story is less about a language than about responsibility. It invites you to become a guardian of ambiguity, to prefer the difficult labor of moral education to the tempting efficiency of engineered calm. Remember the boy in the cabin when you hear a new rhythm in a meeting, a chant in a school, or a cadence in a hospital ward. Ask what it is doing to attention and to heart. The secret is simple and terrible. The words we teach shape the people we will become. Guard those words as if they were the last fragile things worth protecting. Let this be a covenant. Prefer friction, preserve doubt, and resist any tidy language that seeks to straighten human complexity into a smooth, governable surface. Train children to ask why, create institutional safeguards, and preserve unpredictability and mercy as civic goods every day.